Hello and welcome to this sociology lesson, which is all about education, but specifically it's about social and educational policies regarding education. This is part of the Paper 1 course, and in this lesson the aims are to know the aims and features of different governmental educational policies throughout recent history, although really it goes back throughout the history of most of education, to be honest, but also to analyse and evaluate the overall impact of these policies and determine whether or not they increase or reduce inequalities in society. So that's what we're looking for. First of all, though, before we get into any of the education stuff, let's have a little bit of a look and a reminder of what we might refer to as the political spectrum, which, loosely speaking, we can say has a left wing and a right wing. Okay, there's a little bit of a test for us. Here are various values and ideologies of left wing and right wing thought. And can you determine which side which value should go on? Have a quick look at that. Decide which ones would be considered more left wing and which ones would be considered more right wing. Well, there you go. I'm sure you pretty much got that. Left-wing ideologies are traditionally supportive of working classes and their rights. Okay, is where the whole labour movement was born from. They value welfare state and they extend it as much as possible. They believe in that kind of idea of the state and government helping people. Generally speaking, they have what we might refer to as liberal and progressive views, although liberalism itself as a ideology has also been linked to kind of maybe conservatism in its history. In order for the state to be able to support people in the way that they can, they believe in increased taxation and people taking responsibility for their position in society. But with that much government and governmental involvement in the people's day-to-day businesses, obviously an extreme view of these ideas of workers' rights and state involvement, the extreme view ends up with communism. On the right wing, we see more traditional, conservative views about society. They tend to be more supportive of middle classes and the wealthy, believing in that meritocracy of society, that anyone can achieve what they want to be as successful as possible. And they, as a consequence of this, they believe that people should be more self-reliant rather than relying on the state. As a consequence of this, they would prefer to shrink the welfare state and state support, and therefore cut taxation, allow people to keep the money that they have earned. And this means that they end up supporting privatisation as a replacement to state control. And the extreme view that sometimes ends up with right-wing thought is the very extreme, a kind of anarchist thought, but with perhaps more traditional nationalistic views. You end up with kind of maybe racist ideologies at the extremes. So how does this fit into education? Well, politics within education also can organise itself to left and right. So those who follow a more left-wing ideological framework are more likely to want reduced inequality in education as well. There's more likely to be a focus on underachieving groups in society to try and bring about a sense of balance. They would like to widen participation so that there is fewer people excluded from the education system. And, of course, to try and use the education system to improve social mobility amongst social groups, from working class to middle class, for example. On the other hand, the more right-wing view of education would be to have greater choice for students and parents. They believe in there being different types of school to suit specific people, to sort of encounter that, to incorporate those choices. They'd like to reduce the state control and spending as a means to driving up standards. And finally, these ideologies, these beliefs, if you like, are influenced by a school of thought that is referred to as neoliberalism, and the politics of the new right, which itself needs explaining. So neoliberalism is an economic doctrine that has had a major influence on educational policy over the past few decades. Neoliberals such as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, amongst others, argued that the state should not provide services such as education, health and welfare. Neoliberal ideas have been around, as I said, since 1979, but that's irrespective of whether they are conservative, which we might associate more with neoliberal views. But even Labour and the coalition government have continued a lot of the policies that were started in the late 70s. So neoliberalism is based on the idea that the state mustn't dictate to individuals how to dispose of their own property and wealth, and should not try to regulate a free market economy. So governments should encourage competition, privatise state-run businesses, and deregulate markets in a bid to make sure that a nation and the individual be as prosperous as possible. Neoliberals argue that the value of education lies in how well it enables a country to compete in the global marketplace. As I said, for a neoliberal, the bottom line is how successful financially can your nation or individual or business be. They claim that the only way to make sure that can happen is if schools become more like businesses that empower parents and pupils as consumers, and they use competition between schools to drive those standards up. So in your booklet, you'll see a couple of pages that are a handout that explains these things in more detail. Read the booklet and then summarise the following information. Who are the New Right? What are their beliefs? Identify the reasons why the New Right don't believe the state education system works. Why do they believe it is ineffective? What is the solution according to the New Right? Can you outline the research conducted by Chubb and Moe in 1990? What did Chubb and Moe call for and why? What does the New Right believe are the two roles of the state in education? And what are the similarities between the New Right and the views of the functionalists? Finally, how do Gewertz and Ball criticise the idea of a marketplace in education? So, just a few answers to those questions then, starting with who the New Right are and what their beliefs are. Well, as mentioned before, the New Right is a sort of conservative political view. It incorporates this neoliberal economic idea that we mentioned, and that central principle is the belief that the state cannot meet people's needs. The people are the best ones to meet their own needs through free market. Why doesn't the New Right believe that the education system works? Well, the problem with state education for the New Right is that the system takes a one-size-fits-all approach, which imposes a kind of uniformity. It disregards maybe local or individual needs. The New Right believes that the state education system fails because the consumers have no say. That is, the pupils, the parents and the employers. So the New Right argue that because consumers have no power, schools are not answerable to anyone. Therefore, they waste money and are unresponsive and inefficient to need. So for the New Right, what is the solution? They are in favour of what's called the marketisation of education. And so some of these ideas of marketisation were backed up by research, and one or two researchers, I should say, that conducted the research in 1990 were Chubb and Moe in America. So their research was as follows. They compared the achievements of 60,000 pupils from low-income families in over 1,000 state and private schools, and they did parent studies and case studies. Their evidence showed that pupils from low-income families consistently do about 5% better in private schools than in state schools. Furthermore, their study made the following conclusions. State schools have not created equal opportunity and has failed the needs of disadvantaged groups. State-funded school education is inefficient because it fails to produce pupils with the skills needed by the economy. And they also found that private schools deliver higher quality education because, unlike state schools, they are answerable to paying consumers. So what did they say should happen as a consequence of their findings? Well, Chubb and Moe propose for the introduction of a market system in education. They want to put the control into the hands of the consumers, or the parents and the students. They've suggested a voucher system that would allow the consumers to spend on the education of their choice, essentially giving you a voucher to pay for your schooling, but in a school that you want to go to. What would happen here is it would force schools to become responsive to parents' wishes and make schools competitive with one another. So what about the new right? What do they believe actually is the role of the state in education, if anything? Well, actually, they do believe it has a role. They feel that actually the state still needs to be involved in education as a way of regulating it, that the state needs to impose a framework to ensure that competition happens. And this we already see through the league tables that are produced about schools, showing how well they've done in exam results and so on. But also, of course, Ofsted, the school regulator in the UK, who produce reports giving a school a judgment. The other thing that the neoliberals and the new right believe the state should take a role in is transmitting a shared cultural heritage. In other words, affirming a national identity, so that all schools in some ways are promoting the same ideas about nationality, which, as you can see, aligns a lot with the kind of more right-wing views we discussed earlier. And despite this, the new right actually has some similarities with the functionalists that we've studied throughout the course. Much like the functionalists who share this idea of meritocracy, the new right believe that some people are more talented than others and will achieve more than others. Both functionalists and the new right both favour a system which is run on that meritocratic principle, but also is there to serve the needs of the economy. The education system should have a function, and that function should be to benefit society. And then finally, a similarity with the functionalists is that education should socialise pupils into a set of shared values, and it should instil a sense of national identity. Again, for a lot of functionalists, it's not just about upskilling students, it's about preparing them for being part of that society, about making sure that there is a sort of socialisation into what lies ahead. So, there are, of course, evaluation points to this, and there are some criticisms, and those come from writers Gewirtz and Ball, who criticise this idea of a marketplace in education. They argue that competition between schools will benefit the middle classes, who can actually use their cultural and economic capital to access better schools, so it will suit them down to the ground. But there are other criticisms as well. One criticism of the new right's attitudes and ideologies surrounding education is that the real cause of educational standards being low isn't state control, but social inequality and a lack of funding from the state. Furthermore, the new right seems to have a contradiction between its desire for parental choice and state letting go of control, but also the state imposing a compulsory curriculum. And of course, Marxists would argue that education is imposing a culture actually of a dominant minority, not a shared culture amongst all groups. So let's take our delve into history, and we're going to start right at the beginning with the Education Act of 1870. And I'm sure a lot of us had a picture like this in our minds when we think of classrooms from the 19th century. And it all starts with the Education Act, or William Forster's Education Act, which was really the introduction of state education for all pupils aged 5 to 12. And that's where it began. The aim was simply to improve skills for an increasingly industrialised society, to make sure that the people of the society were ready for work. So if this is our starting point, what are we going to need to know throughout the rest of this lesson? Well, we need to know the key policies introduced by successive governments from here on, but particularly the ones that have happened since 1988, which was a significant year for education. We need to know when and why each policy was introduced, the key features of those policies, and of course we need to provide some sort of evaluation of each policy. In other words, what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses of each one? And we're going to fast forward in time a little bit and start with the tripartite system, which actually moves us forward in time to the Butler Education Act of 1944. And again, had you been around at the time, your school photograph may have looked something like this. So Butler's Education Act introduced this idea of the tripartite system in 1944, and after it had become apparent during the Second World War that not all children did have the same access to education. So what the Act did was introduced secondary education for all pupils, providing free education for all up to the age of 15. And it was introduced really to ensure a meritocracy, to try and reduce that inequality in society. Now, the tripartite system of secondary education consisted, as the word suggests, of 3 types of schools, and each one was there to cater for different abilities. So let's think about this in a sort of diagram form, shall we? Here we go. Let's divide our pyramid into 3. And at the top, for the most able students, we had grammar schools, which were selective and were at the top for the most able students. Then we had secondary modern, which probably most students would go to. And then at the bottom of our pyramid, we had the technical skills. Now, to get into a grammar school, students have to pass an 11 plus, which is essentially an entry exam. And if they pass that, they would go on to study O-levels in academic subjects, which is the equivalent of today's GCSEs. But quite often this would lead to access to further education, A-levels, and higher education, a degree. But that was considered really for the smartest in society. Said most students would end up in secondary modern schools, where they would do CSEs, which were qualifications that were in some academic but mostly vocational subjects. And the aim of the secondary modern was to prepare that working class, that majority of the working class, for that workplace and industry. And then for some students, there were these technical schools that focused purely on technical skills that would maybe be suitable for one job only. For example, mechanics that would specialise in an area where that means that your kind of choice of job would be decided before you even left school. And there weren't loads of these. In large, it was mostly secondary modern and grammar schools. They were only dotted around in a few areas of the country. So, can we see the potential issues with this? It was done in good faith to try and raise the educational standards of an entire nation, to try and make sure that everyone had the free education until the age of 15. But what do you think might be bad about this act? What might be bad about the 11 plus testing 11-year-olds? Who would pass it? What might happen in secondary modern schools? So let's do our evaluation of this then. So essentially, middle class children were the ones most likely to pass the 11 plus exam. For example, they might be able to buy tuition to help them pass. So they would be more likely to go to the grammar schools. They were labelled as a consequence as academically bright, and as a result, they usually did well in education and, of course, got better jobs. The working class children that do not have the advantages that were held by middle classes usually failed the 11 plus, and they were labelled as failures and went to secondary modern schools, leaving with perhaps very few qualifications. And so it's kind of arguable to say that really selection into grammar schools might seem as if it's meritocratic, but actually grammar schools were organised by class, not necessarily ability. And for that reason, we can say that the tripartite system can be criticised for reproducing, not reducing class inequality. And if you need to kind of prove this, the best thing to do would be to remind yourself of some of those external factors that can cause a difference in achievement in education that we spent a long time looking at. So think of material, economic, or even cultural factors that cause a difference in achievement. But we're going to zoom forward again in time and have a look at what's known as the comprehensive system. And the image is very much of that traditional comprehensive school from the 1960s. And this happened indeed in the 1960s when the Labour government, led by Prime Minister Harold Wilson, introduced the comprehensive system. And this was because they were unhappy with the way that the tripartite system limited opportunities to specifically working class students, and a Labour government trying to address that. So comprehensive schools were introduced. They weren't selective, there were no entrance exams, and all children were educated in the same local school, regardless of their class, ethnicity, gender or ability. They were usually large schools and provided a broad curriculum and more sporting and recreational activities on top of the traditional academic subjects. And really the access to these schools, as I said, wasn't through achievement, but through a catchment area. So you would go to the school that you lived closest to. And even though these seemed like they were doing a bit more to try and address inequality, they weren't without their own problems. There is an evidence, certainly, to suggest that they did reduce the gap in the class gap in achievement, which is fantastic. There was no selection process. That meant that there was less pressure on students, which is obviously a benefit to students. And actually, if we think about this era and what it did, it brought pupils together from all backgrounds, creating greater sense of social cohesion. However, the system did continue to reproduce class inequality because of a few factors, which included streaming. Many comprehensives were streamed into ability groups, and therefore the middle classes ended up being placed in the higher streams, and the working class pupils were placed in those lower streams. There was also labelling. Stephen Ball, the writer, has shown that even where streaming is not present, working class pupils continue to be labelled negatively, and therefore their opportunities are restricted. And ultimately, these things increased inequality, despite the efforts to try and reduce it. So as we've seen before, streaming has that negative impact. Remind yourself of some of those internal factors again that can cause a difference in achievement in education. And again, think about Marx's perspective on education and what he believes it is actually there to do, part of that ideological state apparatus. In addition to the things that were laid out in the 1960s, in the 1970s the government had to deal with a rise in youth unemployment, and it was argued that schools were not really producing people that had the skills that were necessary by industry. So in 1983, vocational education was introduced. And the idea was to prepare trainees for jobs that are manual and practical, the traditionally non-academic subject. So there are things like the Youth Training Scheme, the YTS, National Vocational Qualifications or NVQs, and then other bigger qualifications, the General National Vocational Qualifications or GNVQs. The problem with this was that the training kind of struggled to be regarded with the same sort of prestige and status as GCSEs or O-levels and A-levels. And some critics claimed that the scheme actually enabled employers to exploit school leavers as cheap labour and provided little substance in the way of a genuine education. But these changes were only the start for the Thatcher government, who arrived in 1979, and as their changes to education paved the way for what became known as the 1988 Education Reform Act. And the architects of this were Education Secretary there on the left, Kenneth Baker, and the Prime Minister of the time, Margaret Thatcher, pictured on the right. And introduced by this government, the 1988 Education Reform Act established that principle of marketisation in education, that principle favoured by the New Right. They believed that by introducing market forces of consumer choice and competition between schools, standards in education would improve. So let's have a look at a few of the key policies in this marketisation of education. Well, the first one is a word known as parentocracy. This means giving power to parents. In other words, parents were given choice about where to send their children to school. It's claimed that this will encourage competition between schools and, as a consequence of that, drive up standards. A second policy was to introduce SATs. These were exams testing children at the end of all of the key stages, so in other words at the end of years 2, 6 and 9, as well as their formal qualifications, and the results would be published. They were introduced to put further pressure on schools to raise standards and improve academic progress of pupils. And this led to league tables. And league tables showed the public schools' exam results. For example, what percentage of Year 11 students achieve 5 or more Cs or above at GCSE, including maths and English. These allow parents to make that informed choice about what school to send their children to, and of course increases that competition between schools. As mentioned before, the New Right believe that the state does have a role in education through regulation, and that's where we get Ofsted. School inspections will encourage schools to raise standards and, once published, allow parents to make decisions about which are the best schools in the area, again increasing competition. The Reform Act also included introduction of the national curriculum. That is a system whereby all schools have to follow the same curriculum, the same subjects, in other words, teach the same thing. And many subjects were made compulsory up until the age of 16. It was there really to increase equality. Everybody had the same educational experience, and arguably allowed more girls, for example, to study science subjects beyond Year 9, when in the past many girls had dropped science when choosing their options, or worse, were forced to. And then finally we have this notion of formula funding, and this is where schools receive the same amount of funding for each pupil. Therefore, the more pupils they attract, the more money they'll get. And this has resulted in schools producing glossy brochures, advertisements and open evenings to attract more and more potential students, making students into a kind of commodity. So after all these changes, and these were quite significant, writers who are in favour of marketisation in education argue that it has put pressure on schools to improve their exam results and raise their standards. However, others, of course, argue that it has led to further inequality, and here are some of those arguments. So, as we said, one argument against this is that it reproduces inequality. So critics of marketisation of education argue that it's increased inequalities between pupils. For example, middle-class parents are better placed to take advantage of these choices. They have the experience and the knowledge to be able to make choices about where to send their children. Middle-class parents take advantage of the choice. Sharon Gewirtz's research found that there are different types of parents. There are the skilled choosers. These are your professional middle-class parents who use their cultural, economic and educational capital to take full advantage of the choices that are available to them. Then you've got your semi-skilled choosers. These are working-class parents who are ambitious for their children but don't have the right capital and find it difficult to make sense of the education market and rely on other people's opinions. And then you have the disconnected choosers, who are likely to be from working class parents lacking that capital, lacking that confidence in choice, and choosing local schools really as their only realistic option. A second critique of the 1988 Education Reform Act is known as cream skimming and silt shifting. And this is to do with the formula funding, which means that more popular schools get more money. These schools can afford to attract better qualified teachers, better facilities. And unfortunately, less popular schools that attract less pupils will lose their income, and so they find it difficult to match the teacher skills and the facilities of their more successful rivals. The exam league tables ensure that schools that achieve good results are in more demand because parents choose these with good league table rankings, which allows these schools to be more selective and recruit the better achieving, mainly middle class pupils. And that's called cream skimming. As a result, middle class pupils get the best education. The opposite occurs for the less successful schools, who are unable to select and tend to recruit the less able, mainly working class pupils. The overall effect of league tables is to produce an unequal school system that reproduces social class inequalities. So there's quite a lot of information there, and sometimes this is better understood by looking at it as a diagram. So you have a school that gets better results than another school. Therefore, it becomes more popular. If it's more popular because of the way that formula funding works, they'll have more money to spend on better facilities. If they've got better facilities, they're going to get better results. If they get better results, the school becomes more popular. But not only does this cycle work where better results ends up in better facilities, which means better results, if you've got more popular, it means you can actually start picking and choosing the students you get. You can pick maybe only the best students to come to your school. And of course, that means you're going to get better results again. And if you've got better results, the school's going to become more popular. And both these things, increased funding and better facilities and cream skimming the better students, leads to a cycle where the better schools will do better and better. But unfortunately, it also leads to that silt shifting, whereby the less able students are left behind to go to the less successful schools. And the cycle repeats itself over and over. The third evaluation point is what Stephen Ball refers to as the myth of parentocracy. He says that marketisation gives the appearance of creating parentocracy, where parents have a free choice over which schools to send their children to. However, he says this is a myth, as actually not all parents have the same freedom of choices. And again, much of this comes down to class inequalities. Gewertz argues that middle-class parents have more economic and cultural capital, money, knowledge, experience, and so, of course, they're better able to take advantage of the choices that are available. For example, in an extreme situation, they may even be able to move house into an area where there is a better school. So a lot going on in the 1988 Education Reform Act, and really the next changes happen when there's that next change of government, when New Labour arrive in 1997 and are in power until 2010. And this happened after 18 years of Conservative rule and the rise of the new right in educational policy. The Labour Party swept to power in 1997 under the leadership of Tony Blair. However, any concerns that Labour would undo years of neoconservative policies were actually allayed when not only did Blair put educational policy front and centre of Labour's electioneering, but also they continued many of the policies of their predecessors. Which might seem strange considering that the Labour Party are traditionally on the left, but actually they did also introduce a number of initiatives that aimed to reduce inequality. For example, Education Action Zones, which were later known as Excellence in City Zones, in which local businesses would become involved in underperforming inner city schools and provide them with additional resources. There's the Aim Higher programme, which sought to raise the aspirations of groups who were underrepresented in higher education at university. And there was the introduction of the Educational Maintenance Allowance, or EMA, and that was introduced to encourage students from low-income families to stay in education after the age of 16, which at that time was not compulsory. And the Labour government also wished to promote a greater diversity and choice, in a similar ideology to the marketisation of schools, and move away from that one-size-fits-all comprehensive system that had been criticised by neoliberals. So Labour introduced the specialist school status, which meant that schools could apply to have a specialism, such as maths or performing arts, and thus giving parents a greater choice, allowing schools to build on their strengths. Now, evidence suggests that this has raised standard within specialist schools that have better exam results than those with non-specialist status. However, it is unclear whether that has actually reduced the inequality between social groups. The other policy to give parents greater choice was the introduction of academies. They promoted academies as a policy for raising achievement. Most were actually previously underperforming schools with largely working class pupils, and it's claimed that academy status will raise the achievement of those working class pupils. And the impact of these Labour policies, including many compensatory education schemes, including Sure Start centres, free childcare for preschool children, has widely seen as efforts to level that playing field in society. Disadvantaged groups were supported more and seemingly had more opportunities. Participation in further education and higher education widened, which is seen as evidence that the initiatives were working to increase social mobility. However, there were a few things that felt like they were adding to the inequalities. The big one of the Labour government was the introduction of tuition fees. Many saw Labour's policies as contradictory, because on the one hand they introduced EMA to encourage participation in further education and get people to university, but they also introduced university tuition fees, which hadn't been there before. £3,000 a year to go to university, and many people and students protested this move and saw the policy as a step in the wrong direction. Jeff Whitty in 2003 claims that the Labour government remained committed to marketisation and those neoliberal new right policies, and therefore they did not tackle inequality. For example, by introducing tuition fees, they deterred many working class students from going to university. And despite the Labour Party's opposition to private education, they didn't abolish private schools, and they also allowed existing grammar schools to continue operating on a sort of reinforcing that two-tier system that obviously benefited the middle classes. So where after 2010 and the end of the Labour government? Well, we had our coalition government, which takes us from 2010 to the present. New Labour's tenure came to an end when the government was a coalition between Conservatives, led by Prime Minister David Cameron on the left there, and Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg on the right, who was leader of the Liberal Democrats. Now, at the term of writing, which is early 2024, there have currently been 10 education secretaries since that coalition government came into power in 2010. We've had, from left to right, Michael Gove, Nicky Morgan, Justine Greening, Damien Hines, Gavin Williamson, and then along the bottom row, Nadeem Zahawi, Michelle Donnellan, James Cleverly, Kit Malthouse, and current Education Secretary Gillian Keegan. Now, the educational policies of this era do reflect that new right neoliberal ideas, based on reducing the role of the state in that provision of education. And policies have included increasing tuition fees. That means students now have to pay up to £9,000 per year for university courses, which may deter poorer working class students from applying at all to university, increasing the gap between middle class and working class educational achievement, and ultimately middle class and lower working class wages. They've also continued to promote academies. From 2010, schools were encouraged to leave the local authority control and become an academy. Money was taken from local authorities, for example Sefton, and given directly to the schools by central government. Academies are given more control over how they're run, what subjects to teach, again offering parents more choice. Some of these academies are actually run by private educational businesses and are funded directly by the state. There was also the introduction of free schools. Now, free schools are schools that are funded by the state but are set up and run by groups such as parents, teachers, faith leaders, or even businesses rather than local authorities. However, research suggests that they really only benefit from highly educated families, and they're also criticised for having lower standards and taking fewer poor children compared to the other types of schools. Although research into this area is worth having a look at, there are some really interesting free schools out there, as well as ones that have not made it very far into their educational journey. So let's have a look at some of the compensatory education schemes that have been put into place since 2010. And this is particularly significant because in 2008 there was a global financial crisis which led to many countries, including the UK, falling into a deep recession. The subsequent job losses and repossessions of homes, for example, put many people into hugely difficult financial situations. The coalition government at the time introduced some measures to support those who were living with that material deprivation, and these included things like the pupil premium. That was a money that schools would receive, extra money for each pupil that came from a disadvantaged background. And of course free school meals, which, although they've been around for the poorest in society for over a century, in 2013 the Department of Education announced that all infant school pupils, that is pupils in reception in years 1 and 2, in a state-funded school in England would be eligible for a free school meal. However, the government's main financial strategy to deal with the financial crisis was to enforce austerity measures, which meant cuts to every department across the country, including education. So that meant things like spending on school buildings were cut. The Sure Start centres, which had meant so much to so many people, many of them were closed. The educational maintenance allowance that was encouraging people to go into further education was abolished and replaced with the bursary. And of course, as we saw before, university tuition fees were tripled. Critics argue that these cuts and these policies have reduced opportunities for working class pupils and actually increased that inequality in educational achievement between the middle classes and the working class children. And to add insult to injury, Ofsted in 2012 found that in many cases the pupil premium mentioned above as a form of compensatory education is not actually spent on the deprived children it's supposed to help. So there we go. A whistle-stop tour of the many educational policies since 1870. But let's have a little bit of a think about the future of educational policy. And increasingly we see that the future of educational policy, as more and more of the responsibility is dealt with by the state, is in the hands of the private sector. And we see an increasing privatisation of education. And that is the transfer of the public assets, things like the schools themselves, to private companies. In recent years, there's been a trend towards privatisation of aspects of education, and there are lots of examples of this. Private companies now design, build and finance schools. Local education authorities like Sefton pay a monthly lease out of public funds to use those buildings and those facilities. According to Stephen Bull, private companies involved in such work make huge profits out of education. Another aspect is globalisation. That means the world is becoming more interconnected because of advances in technology, communication, and of course transport links. Many private companies involved in education are foreign owned. The exam board, for example, Edexcel, is owned by the US company Pearson. Also, much of the software provided to schools can come from global multinational corporations such as Disney and Mattel. So we see a globalisation of education, which might sound good on the surface, but really much of it is benefiting these big multinational corporations. And then we have this theory or this term, the colorization of schools. Private sector is also involved indirectly in education. For example, have you ever thought about where the vending machines come from in schools and college premises? Often schools will have their own cafe or canteen owned by a bigger organisation, a more corporate element. You've also got private companies such as Cadbury's and Tesco's providing equipment for schools in return for people buying their products. Remember the computers for schools or sporting equipment for schools policies in Tesco supermarkets, or even computer software being provided or sportswear being sponsored. All of this is part of that privatisation of education. Stephen Ball concludes that privatisation is becoming increasingly involved in education. He argues that moving educational services out of the public sector, controlled by the government, into that private sector is turning education into an object of private profit-making. And so a Marxist such as Stuart Hall would argue that the claim that privatisation will drive up competition standards is a myth, used to legitimise the turning of education into a source of private profit. In other words, the education system and therefore the state is being exploited by these private companies under the guise that it will make people smarter and it will encourage competition. As we move along, we should look at also and summarise some of the educational policies over the years that have had an impact on different social groups. Because undoubtedly different policies throughout the years have had a varied impact on different social groups. If we begin with gender, the differences in achievement have been clear for us to see. For example, the introduction of the national curriculum actually made it compulsory for girls to study science up to the age of 16, whereas before they weren't able or committed to do that. The national literacy strategy includes a focus on improving boys' reading, where they've previously fallen behind. And there are various initiatives and projects, things like the Playing for Success scheme uses football and other sports to boost motivation amongst boys who, again, for many years have been falling behind girls' educational achievements. Likewise, there have been many policies aimed at raising the achievements of children from minority ethnic backgrounds, and these have gone through several phases. In the 1960s and 70s, we had assimilation. These policies aim to help ethnic minority pupils assimilate or become part of the British culture, as many of them and their families would have arrived fairly recently at this point. For example, helping them to learn English through compensatory education. And once we got through the assimilation part of schemes that were encouraging those from ethnic backgrounds to have greater equality, we have maybe more multicultural education. These policies of the 1980s aim to raise self-esteem and achievement of ethnic minority pupils by valuing all cultures in the school curriculum. For example, teaching about different religions, learning about the history of other cultures would lead to acceptance and diversity. Although, as we've seen, maybe in recent years that doesn't happen as much as it could do, or perhaps should do. So, let's have a little final thoughts on this. Quick recap as to where we are now. Well, suffice to say, policies continue to marketise education and provide parents with that greater choice through academies, free schools and continuing grammar schools. And there is also some academic support out there for disadvantaged groups, that compensatory education schemes in its many guises. However, there is no denying that inequality in education achievement still exists. Middle classes still benefit from choices available. Parents can still use their economic, educational and cultural capital to ensure that their middle class students are in the best schools and outperform their working class peers. Girls continue to outperform boys, and the gap between the highest and lowest achieving ethnic groups is still significant. Well, that's about it. A lot to think about there, continuing to think about marketisation and privatisation of schools as well. But have a look at the rest of the booklet where there are some exam-based questions and some questions for you to answer about your consolidating thoughts on this area. But thanks very much for listening. Goodbye.